I want to tell you about the Tuesday afternoon I discovered I did not own my home. I was sitting in my solicitor's office, in the kind of upright chair that solicitors' offices always seem to have, practical, slightly uncomfortable, designed for people who are there to conduct business rather than linger. I was there because my boiler had been replaced the previous month and the contractor had said something about needing to confirm ownership for the warranty documentation, and my solicitor, a woman named Helen who had handled my affairs for 22 years, had offered to pull together the relevant title documents. I had expected this to take 20 minutes. I had planned to stop at the baker's on the way home. Helen had been looking at her computer screen for several minutes with an expression I could not quite read. She had asked me twice to confirm my address. She had asked me once to confirm my date of birth. She had then been quiet for a period that was slightly longer than comfortable. She said, "Vera, I need to ask you something directly. Are you aware of a transfer of title on your property, Hillside Cottage, Birch Lane, that took place approximately 10 years ago?" I said, "A transfer of title. What does that mean exactly?" She said, "It means a change of ownership. According to the land registry records I am looking at, Hillside Cottage was transferred from your sole ownership to your son's name 10 years ago this November. The transfer was registered. It appears to have been processed correctly. But I wanted to ask you directly, do you remember authorizing this?" I sat in the upright chair. I thought about the house I had lived in for 50 years. The garden I had tended for 50 years. The kitchen where I had cooked 50 years of meals. The bedroom where my husband had died, in the same house, in the room we had shared for 38 of those 50 years. I said, "No. I do not remember authorizing that. I would not have authorized that. That is my home." Helen said, "Then I think we need to have a very careful conversation about what has happened here. My name is Vera. I am 78 years old. And what I am about to tell you is the story of how I discovered that the ground beneath the 50 years I had built my life on was not quite as solid as I had believed, and what I found when I started digging. Before I tell you what happened with the house, I need to tell you about the house itself, because the house is not just the legal subject of this story. The house is the story. Hillside Cottage is not, despite its name, a cottage in the chocolate box sense. It is a 4-bedroom detached house on a quiet lane in a village that has grown, over the 50 years I have lived here, from a genuinely rural community into something that property agents now describe as highly desirable countryside within commuting distance. The name was given by the previous owners and stuck because we liked it, and because the house does sit at the top of a gentle slope with a view across the valley that, on clear days, extends further than seems quite plausible. My husband Gerald and I bought Hillside Cottage in 1974, when we were both in our late 20s, when the price was something that a secondary school teacher and a part-time bookkeeper could afford on a stretch, when the lane was unpaved and the nearest shop was a 15-minute walk and the whole enterprise felt slightly mad and completely right. We raised our children in that house. Our son Martin, who is the eldest and the subject of what comes later. Our daughter Rose, who moved to New Zealand 20 years ago and whose absence I have learned to carry the way you carry most permanent things, with a resigned acceptance that does not prevent it from aching occasionally. And our youngest, Thomas, who died at 8 years old from a congenital heart condition that we had known about from his first year and had hoped, with the specific hope of parents who cannot do otherwise, might resolve itself. Thomas's room is the smallest bedroom, at the back of the house, overlooking the garden. I have kept it as a room. I use it as a study now. His things are not preserved there in any shrine-like way. I am not a woman who requires physical relics to maintain memory, but it is his room and I have never felt moved to designate it as anything else. Gerald died 15 years ago. A stroke, at 68, in the garden, which was where he had spent most of his happiest hours and which seems, in retrospect, like the correct place for it, though the correctness of it did not make the finding of him any less brutal. After Gerald died, I lived in Hillside Cottage alone for 15 years. I kept the garden because Gerald would have been distressed by its neglect and because I had, over 38 years of watching him tend it, absorbed enough to maintain it if not to advance it. I kept the vegetable beds going until 3 years ago when my knees made bending down a negotiation rather than a given, and I handed them over to a local young man named Tom who comes once a week and who has, to his credit, maintained Gerald's standards. The house is worth, in the current market, somewhere between £750,000 and £850,000, depending on which agent you ask and what mood the market is in that particular week. This is a fact I am aware of because it is difficult to live in a village that has become highly desirable without being regularly informed of the value of things. I had not thought of Hillside Cottage in terms of its market value for most of the 50 years I lived there. It was not an asset. It was my home. The place where Gerald and I had built everything. Where Thomas's room still smelled, very faintly, of the particular soap he had used as a child. I have always told myself this is my imagination, but I have never been certain. It was mine. And then it was not. Or rather, it had not been mine, apparently, for the previous 10 years, and I had simply not known. I need to tell you about Martin before I tell you what he had done, because Martin is not a simple person and what he did was not a simple thing, and I think the complexity matters. Martin is 54 years old. He is a civil servant, senior grade, with responsibility for a department I have never fully understood, involving procurement and contracts and the management of large amounts of public money. He is good at his job. He has been told he is good at his job by people in positions to evaluate such things, and I have always believed that this assessment is accurate. Martin inherited from his father a specific kind of practical intelligence, the ability to see a situation systemically, to understand not just the individual elements but the structure connecting them. He also inherited from me, I think, a stubbornness that he would call principled and that I have occasionally called inflexible, and which has served him very well in his professional life and rather less well in his personal one. He was married for 12 years, to a woman named Julia, and the marriage ended in a way that was painful for everyone involved, most particularly for their 2 children, my grandchildren, now 15 and 17, who had to navigate the particular complexity of parents who had stopped being able to be in the same room without the temperature dropping. Martin had struggled financially after the divorce. Not dramatically, he had his salary, which was substantial, and the settlement had been handled without the worst kind of legal conflict. But the cost of maintaining 2 separate households, of school fees for children he and Julia had always agreed would go to private school, of the mortgage on the house he had bought Julia and the children in the aftermath of the separation, these costs had, for several years, required him to manage his money very carefully. I had known this. He had told me, in the specific way that Martin tells me things, directly, factually, without asking for sympathy and therefore not receiving as much as he perhaps needed. He had said, perhaps 7 years into the post-divorce period, the finances are tight, Mum. I manage. But they're tight. And I had said the things a mother says, and offered what help I could, and he had declined in the way Martin declines things, which is with thanks and a change of subject. What I had not known, what I would not know for some time after the afternoon in Helen's office, was that Martin had, during this financially constrained period, made a decision about Hillside Cottage that I had not been party to. Or had I? That was the question that would occupy the next 3 months of my life. When I left Helen's office that Tuesday afternoon, with a set of photocopied land registry documents in a folder and a follow-up appointment booked for the following week, I did not call Martin. I drove home. I parked in the driveway of Hillside Cottage. I sat in the car for perhaps 20 minutes, looking at the front of the house, the Virginia creeper that had climbed the left side of the facade since 1987, the window of Thomas's room at the back corner, the garden gate Gerald had installed and which had sagged slightly to the left ever since and which I had always meant to have adjusted and had never gotten around to. I thought, this is my house. Whatever the land registry says. This is my house. Then I went inside and I made tea and I sat at the kitchen table and I began, very carefully, to think about the last 10 years. 10 years ago I was 68 years old. Gerald had been dead for 5 years. Rose was in New Zealand. Martin was in the middle of his divorce proceedings. I tried, sitting at my kitchen table, to reconstruct what had been happening 10 years ago in sufficient detail to understand whether there was a moment, an occasion, a conversation, in which a transfer of the title of Hillside Cottage might have been discussed or requested or presented to me for signature. I am a thorough woman. I keep records. Gerald always said I was the only person he knew who filed receipts for things that had already been paid and were never going to be queried, and he was right, and I have never found a situation in which this habit was anything other than useful. I went to the filing cabinet in Thomas's room, my study, and I pulled out the folder labeled property/house and I sat on the floor, which my knees complained about and which I did anyway, and I went through every document in it. The folder contained the original purchase documents from 1974. It contained the remortgage paperwork from 1989 when we had extended to build the kitchen extension. It contained the correspondence with the previous managing agents when we had briefly rented out the annex, in the 90s, to a series of young men who had been varying degrees of responsible tenants. It contained insurance documents, spanning 50 years, in neat chronological order. It did not contain anything relating to a transfer of title. I also went through my files from 10 years ago specifically. I had a box labeled 2013 to 2015 which contained the general correspondence and paperwork from those years. Bills. Letters. The documentation from a small investment Gerald had left me that I had restructured during that period. A letter from Rose about her plans to stay in Auckland permanently. Martin's Christmas card, handwritten, mentioning that the divorce proceedings were progressing and that he was managing. Nothing about the house. Nothing that looked like anything I had signed relating to property. I went to bed that night having identified nothing that explained the land registry entry. I also called Helen that evening and asked her to send me the actual transfer document, the specific legal paperwork that had been filed with the land registry 10 years ago. Helen emailed it to me the following morning. It was 4 pages long. On page 3 was a signature. Above the signature was printed my name, Vera Margaret Clarkson. The signature bore a resemblance to mine. The general shape of it, the way the V swept down and the C had a particular rightward lean, it was close. But it was not mine. I had been signing my name for 78 years. I know its specific, individual quirks the way I know the shape of my own hands. The signature on that document was close enough to have passed a non-expert's inspection, but it was not quite right. The angle of the V was slightly off. The final flourish of the N was longer than I ever make it. Someone had signed my name on a property transfer document. And the house had been registered in my son's name. I sat at the kitchen table with the printed document in front of me and I thought about Martin and his divorce and his financial difficulties and his practical intelligence and his principled inflexibility, and I felt something I have rarely felt in 78 years. I felt the specific cold of betrayal by someone you love. Then I thought, but I do not know everything yet. I am thorough. I will know everything before I act. I called Helen and asked her to recommend a handwriting expert. What followed were 3 months that I would describe, if I were being honest with myself and with you, as among the most focused of my 78 years. I want to tell you about those 3 months in some detail, because the detail matters to understanding what I found and why it changed everything. The handwriting expert was a woman named Dr. Patricia Holt, who had 30 years of experience in forensic document examination and who came to me through a recommendation from Helen's colleague who dealt with fraud cases. Dr. Holt reviewed the signature on the transfer document alongside 5 samples of my genuine signature from various documents across the preceding 10 years. Her conclusion was delivered in writing, precise and unambiguous, The signature on the transfer document was not consistent with the samples of Vera Margaret Clarkson's genuine signature and showed characteristics consistent with skilled simulation, that is, a deliberate attempt to reproduce rather than a spontaneous act of signing. Skilled simulation. Someone had practiced my signature. Had copied it carefully enough to pass a basic review. Had not been careful enough to fool someone who knew what they were looking for. Helen, with Dr. Holt's report in hand, filed a formal complaint with the land registry and initiated a process of investigation that I will not detail in full because it involved a great deal of correspondence and several weeks of waiting and very little of what I would describe as dramatic progress, though it was moving forward. In the meantime, I continued my own investigation. Not into the legal mechanics, Helen was handling those. Into Martin. I want to be precise about what I mean by investigating Martin. I did not hire a private detective. I did not go through his personal correspondence without permission. What I did was this: I thought very carefully about everything I knew about my son and the period 10 years ago, and I looked for things I had not previously connected. The first thing I found was a conversation I had half remembered and then filed away as something I had misunderstood at the time. Approximately 10 years ago, during a visit to Hillside Cottage, Martin had mentioned, in the context of a wider conversation about estate planning and inheritance, that it might be worth considering putting the house in his name for tax efficiency purposes. He had explained this quickly, using terminology I had not entirely followed, and had said he could look into the specifics if I was interested. I had said I would think about it. I had thought about it, briefly, and had not been comfortable with the idea of changing anything to do with the house, and had intended to tell Martin this at a subsequent conversation but had never quite gotten around to it because Martin had not raised it again and I had assumed he had dropped the idea. I had never told him yes. But I had also never told him no. I turned this over in my mind many times across those 3 months. The second thing I found was in Martin's mortgage documents from the period. Martin had, in the aftermath of his divorce, taken out a mortgage on the house he had bought Julia and the children. When he had mentioned the tight finances to me, I had not thought to ask about the specific structure of his financial arrangements. But when Helen, extending her investigation, obtained information about the legal and financial record around the time of the transfer, she found something that changed the picture significantly. Martin had, at approximately the time of the transfer, made an application for a substantial personal loan. The application had been made to a private lender rather than a high street bank. The application had listed, among Martin's assets, ownership of Hillside Cottage. Helen called me with this information on a gray Thursday morning. She said, "Vera, I want to be careful about what conclusions we draw from this. What I can tell you is that the timing is consistent with the transfer being used to establish an asset base for a loan application. What I cannot tell you, from the information I have, is whether this was the purpose of the transfer or simply something that happened concurrently." I said, "Was the loan taken out?" She said, "Yes. And it was repaid, in full, approximately 2 years later." I said, "And the house, was it used as security for the loan?" She said, "It was listed as an asset on the application. Whether it served as formal security, I would need to investigate further." I sat with this information. The picture that was assembling itself was this: Martin, in financial difficulty following his divorce, had needed access to money. He had needed either a loan or the appearance of assets sufficient to secure one. The house, if in his name, provided that appearance. He had transferred the house, forging my signature to do it, used it to establish the loan, repaid the loan 2 years later, and then, what? Planned to transfer the house back? Forgotten to? Or intended, at some level, to keep it? None of those explanations made what he had done acceptable. But the shape of the motivation, the specific financial desperation of a man who had needed something and had taken, temporarily, the thing most available, was something I could, in a complicated and not entirely comfortable way, begin to understand even as I could not begin to excuse it. I told Helen I was ready to confront Martin. She advised me to do so with her present. I said I would think about it. I thought about it for 3 days. Then I called Martin and said I would like him to come to Hillside Cottage at the weekend. I said there was something I needed to discuss. He said of course, he would come on Saturday. Was everything all right? I said, I'll tell you on Saturday. Martin arrived on Saturday morning at 10 o'clock. He was alone. I had asked him specifically to come alone, without mentioning why, and he had complied, which told me something about his instincts, though I was not sure yet whether it told me he was guilty or simply that he had heard something in my voice that suggested the occasion was not a casual one. I had considered a great many approaches to this conversation over the preceding week. I had considered beginning with the land registry documents directly, placing them on the table and asking him to explain. I had considered beginning with the signature comparison, showing him Dr. Holt's report before he had any context for why it existed. I had considered beginning with the loan application. In the end, I began the way I always begin difficult conversations, which is by making tea and sitting across from the person at the kitchen table. Martin sat across from me. He was 54, but he had, in the kitchen of the house where he had grown up, the specific quality of a much younger man, aware that he was on home territory in the most complex sense of that phrase. I placed the land registry document on the table. I said, Martin, this is a document that says you have owned Hillside Cottage for the past 10 years. I would like you to explain it to me. He looked at the document for a long time. He did not say he didn't know what it was. He did not say there had been a mistake. He looked at it with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a particular thing and has known, at some level, that it was coming. He said, Mum. I said, I'd like you to explain it, please. He said, I can explain. It's not what it looks like. I said, then please tell me what it is. What Martin told me, over the next hour and a half, was this. 10 years ago, in the aftermath of the divorce, he had been in serious financial difficulty. More serious than he had communicated to me. The school fees, the costs of 2 households, the debt accumulated during the marriage that had not been fully disclosed during the settlement proceedings, the total had been, in his words, genuinely terrifying. He had been managing a level of financial anxiety that had, for a period, been affecting his sleep, his work performance, his general functioning. He had needed access to a significant amount of money to clear the most pressing debts and stabilize his position. He had been refused by 2 high street banks. A colleague had recommended a private lender who was willing to provide a loan against assets. The asset required was property. Martin had not owned property in his own name at that point. The divorce settlement had transferred his share of the marital home to Julia and the children. He had nothing to offer as an asset. And then he had thought about Hillside Cottage. He said, I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I would sort out the finances, repay the loan, transfer the house back, and you would never know it had happened and no one would be harmed. I told myself it was borrowing, not taking. I said, and the signature? A long silence. He said, the conversation we had about putting the house in my name, I told myself you had agreed in principle. I told myself I was acting on what you had said. I knew that was not quite true. But I needed to not think about that part clearly in order to do it. I said, you forged my signature, Martin. He said, yes. One word. Yes. No qualification. No further attempt at explanation. The kitchen was very quiet. I said, and the transfer back? You said it was temporary. He said, I couldn't. I repaid the loan. The immediate crisis was over. And then I couldn't bring myself to raise the subject because raising the subject meant explaining what I had done, and every month that passed made the explanation harder. And then more months passed. And more. And I told myself you would never know. That the house would come to me in your will eventually and the whole thing would just resolve itself. I said, you plan to inherit the house you had already taken from me. He looked at the table. He said, when you say it like that. I said, I am saying it like that because that is what it was. The kitchen was very quiet again. Martin said, I know. I said, I have 3 things I need to say to you, and then I am going to ask you to leave and give me time to think. He said, of course. I said, the first thing is that what you did was a crime. You forged a legal document. You obtained a financial product under false pretenses. You deprived me of ownership of my home for 10 years without my knowledge or consent. These are not matters of interpretation. They are legal facts, and I have legal advice on them. He nodded. I said, the second thing is that you are my son, and I know why you did it, and knowing why does not make it right, but it does make it comprehensible to me in a way that a stranger's actions would not be comprehensible. You were desperate and afraid, and you made a choice that was wrong in a way that you understood was wrong even as you made it. That is its own kind of information. He looked up. I said, the third thing is this. This house was where Thomas lived for 8 years. It is where your father died. It is where I have lived for 50 years. It is not an asset. It is not a piece of financial strategy. It is my home and my life and the physical container of everything that matters to me. And you used it without asking me, for your own purposes, and you kept using it, kept registering it in your name, kept allowing the situation to continue, for 10 years. That is the thing I am going to need the most time to come to terms with. Martin had tears on his face. I do not think he had expected me to mention Thomas. I do not think he had thought, in his financial desperation a decade ago, about Thomas's room. I said, please go now. I'll call you when I'm ready to talk about what happens next. He went. I sat at the kitchen table for a very long time. Then I called Helen. I called Rose in New Zealand the same evening. It was morning in Auckland when the call connected. Rose was at her kitchen table with coffee, having just sent her children to school, and she received the news about the house in the way that Rose receives almost everything, with an initial silence while she processes, followed by a response that is more measured than the silence had suggested it might be. She said, Mum. Are you all right? I said, I am all right. I am angry. I am sad. I am confused about several things simultaneously. But I am all right. She said, tell me everything. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which Rose always does and which I have always found one of the most valuable qualities in a person, the ability to listen completely before responding. When I finished, she said, what do you want to do? I said, I want the house back in my name. That is the non-negotiable thing. Everything else, what happens to Martin legally, what happens to our relationship, I need time to think about. She said, do you want me to come? I said, not yet. Maybe later. I want to think through the legal situation first, and I want to do that without managing anyone's emotional response to it, including yours. Rose laughed, briefly, the specific laugh of someone recognizing a truth about themselves. She said, that is extremely fair. She said, Mum, can I ask you something? I said, of course. She said, you said you're confused about several things. What are you confused about? I thought about how to answer this honestly. I said, I am confused about the last 10 years. About whether I was somehow, not aware, but adjacent to not being aware. About whether there were things I chose not to examine too closely because examining them would have been uncomfortable. Martin talked about the conversation we had where I said I would think about the house. I had forgotten that conversation. Or rather, I had filed it under resolved without confirming the resolution. I wonder whether I should have followed up. Rose said, Mum. He forged your signature. That is not a thing you failed to prevent. That is a thing he did. I said, I know. I am not assigning myself responsibility for his choices. I am trying to understand, as completely as possible, everything that contributed to where we are. She said, that is very you. I said, I taught him, you know. I taught both of you. That the most important thing to understand about a situation is never just the event itself but the context that produced it. That you cannot respond well to something you don't understand completely. Rose said, and do you understand it completely? I said, not yet. But I am working on it. She said, call me when you do. Any time. Any hour. I said, I will. Thank you for listening. After the call I went upstairs to Thomas's room. I sat in the chair at the desk that had been his. The room smelled of the particular combination of old house and evening air that it had always smelled of, and I sat there for a long time and I thought about what it meant to be responsible for a place, and what it meant to take something that belonged to someone without asking, and whether the intention to restore it was a meaningful distinction or simply the story you told yourself so you could do the taking. I did not arrive at a clean answer that evening. I did not expect to. The legal process of restoring Hillside Cottage to my name took 8 months. I want to be honest about why it took so long, because I think the reason matters to the story. The immediate legal mechanism, filing the complaint with the land registry, establishing that the transfer had been fraudulent on the basis of a forged signature, requesting restoration of original ownership, was straightforward enough in principle and took several months in practice because land registry processes are thorough and do not accelerate for anyone's emotional urgency. But the additional time came from a decision I made. Approximately 6 weeks after my confrontation with Martin, he came back to Hillside Cottage. He called first, which I had asked him to do, and I said he could come. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, in the same chair as before. He said, Mum, I want to tell you something I didn't tell you the last time. Something I should have told you and didn't because I don't fully know why. Perhaps because it makes me look worse in one way and better in another and I wasn't sure which version of me you would receive. I said, tell me. He said, I didn't keep the house in my name out of, it wasn't just inertia. It wasn't just that I couldn't face the conversation. I kept it because I thought, I genuinely believed, Mum, and I know how this sounds, that if the house was in my name, I could protect it. If you ever became ill. If there were ever care costs. If there were ever creditors or claims against your estate from anything unexpected. I told myself that the transfer had been wrong, that I needed to reverse it, but that in the meantime it was also doing something useful. That you were safe as long as I was the legal owner because nothing could attach to the house without going through me. I sat with this. I said, you were protecting me. He said, I was also protecting myself from the consequences of what I had done. Both things were true at the same time. I am not asking you to receive the protection as an excuse. I am asking you to receive it as part of the truth. I thought about this for a long time. I said, Martin. The people who hurt us while also loving us are the most confusing people in our lives. I have spent 60 years knowing that and it still doesn't make the hurt uncomplicated when it arrives. He said, I know. I said, I believe you about the protection. I believe that alongside the self-interest and the cowardice there was also genuine care. I have spent enough time thinking about who you are to believe that. He said, what does that mean for what happens next? I said, it means I have decided not to pursue the criminal route. Helen has advised me that I have grounds to report the forgery as a criminal matter. I have decided not to do that. I am telling you this now so you know it is a decision I have made, not something I am uncertain about. He said, Mum. I said, I am not doing it because you deserve to be protected from consequences. You do not. I am doing it because a criminal prosecution would consume the remaining years of both our lives in a way that would serve justice in the abstract and destroy us specifically. And I am 78 years old and Thomas is gone and your father is gone and Rose is in New Zealand and you are what I have left of the family I built in this house, and I am not willing to spend my remaining time on legal proceedings against my son. The kitchen was entirely quiet. Martin said, I don't deserve that. I said, probably not. But it is what I have decided. The house will be returned to my name through the land registry process Helen is managing. You will sign whatever needs to be signed to facilitate that, without delay and without condition. And then we will decide, separately and over time, what our relationship looks like going forward. He said, yes. Whatever you need. I said, I need the house. I need my name on it. I need Thomas's room to belong to the right person. He understood about Thomas without me explaining. That is the thing about Martin. He has always understood the important things, even when understanding them was not enough to make him do them. What I have told you so far is the story as I understood it for the first 8 months. What I am about to tell you is what I learned in month 9, from a source I had not anticipated, that changed the shape of the story one final time. Martin's daughter, my granddaughter Clara, who is 17, came to Hillside Cottage on her own one Saturday in September. Clara is the older of Martin's 2 children. She is 17 and she has, in the specific way of the children of difficult divorces, become wise beyond her years in some respects and younger than her years in others. She is perceptive in a way that sometimes catches adults off guard. She had always had a particular relationship with me. She had spent several school holidays at Hillside Cottage while Martin and Julia had navigated the early years of their separation, and in those holidays we had built something between us that was closer and more honest than the careful adult-child relationship that grandparents and grandchildren sometimes maintain. She arrived at 10 in the morning and said she wanted to talk to me about her dad. I made tea. We sat at the kitchen table. She said, Grandma, I know what Dad did. He told me. He told me and Ollie last month because he said we were old enough to know and he didn't want us to hear it from somewhere else. I said, that took courage. She said, I was angry at first. Really angry. Because it's your house. And he just took it. But then he told us the rest and I've been thinking about whether you know the rest. I said, what rest? Clara said, did he tell you about the letter he found? I said, no. What letter? She said, this is the part that's been bothering me. Because I think he should have told you this part and he didn't and I've decided I'm going to, because I think you deserve to know it. She said, when Dad was going through the financial crisis, just before he did the thing with the house, he found a letter. In Granddad Gerald's study. He'd been clearing it out, you asked him to, after Granddad died, and he had been doing it in stages because it was hard. And in the back of one of the desk drawers he found an envelope addressed to him. From Granddad. Written before Granddad died and left there deliberately. I stared at her. I said, Gerald left Martin a letter. She said, yes. And Dad read it. And the letter said, Dad read it to us, Grandma, he read it to us word for word. The letter said, Martin, if you are ever in serious trouble and need to use the house, use it. Your mother will be safe as long as I am here, and if I am not here, you will know better than anyone what she needs. I trust you. Dad. I put my teacup down very carefully. The kitchen was completely still. She said, Dad says he should have told you about the letter when he told you everything else. He says the letter doesn't excuse what he did, it doesn't excuse the forgery, it doesn't excuse the 10 years, but it explains why he didn't feel like a straightforward criminal doing it. He felt like he was, like Granddad had given him permission in a way he hadn't expected. I sat at the kitchen table of my house for a very long time without speaking. I thought about Gerald. I thought about the specific quality of Gerald's mind, the systemic thinking, the long view, the way he had always prepared for things before they were necessary. I thought about the fact that Gerald had known, when he wrote that letter, that Martin was the kind of person who might need that specific permission under specific circumstances. I thought about the fact that Gerald had not told me. I said to Clara, "Did your father tell you whether the letter said anything about telling me?" She said, "He said the letter said, she'll understand when the time is right. I trust you to know when that is." I said, 10 years was not the right time. Clara said, "No. Dad knows that." I said, "And the forgery, the letter did not give him permission to forge my signature." Clara said, "No. He knows that too. He says the letter made him feel like the end was justified. And then he did something unjustifiable to reach it. He says those are separate things even if his brain treated them as connected at the time." I looked at my 17-year-old granddaughter across the kitchen table. I said, "You are very wise for your age." She said, "I've had a complicated few years." I said, "Yes. You have." I said, "Clara. Thank you for telling me. I know it was not easy to come here alone and say this." She said, "Dad doesn't know I'm here." I wasn't sure if I should come. But I kept thinking about you not knowing. And it seemed like you should know the whole truth. I said, "Yes. The whole truth is always better than the partial truth, however much harder it is." After Clara left, I went to Gerald's study. It is still called that, still laid out roughly as he left it, because I have not had the heart to fully transform it into something that is only mine. I opened the desk drawer that Martin had cleared out, years ago, when I had asked him to. It was empty now, of course. Had been empty for years. I sat in Gerald's chair and I thought about my husband, who had been gone for 15 years and who had apparently, in the full knowledge of who his son was and what his son might someday need, prepared a permission that had been both a gift and a complication and that had reached me 15 years after his death through a 17-year-old girl who had decided, on her own initiative, that I deserved the whole truth. She'll understand when the time is right. I sat in Gerald's chair for a long time, thinking about whether I understood. The land registry completed the restoration of Hillside Cottage to my sole name in November, exactly 10 years, to the month, after Martin had transferred it out of my name. Helen called me with the confirmation on a Friday afternoon. She said, "Vera, Hillside Cottage is yours. Registered in your sole name as of this morning." I said, "Thank you, Helen, for everything." She said, "Are you all right?" I thought about this. I said, "I am all right. I am also many other things that I am still working through. But yes. All right." After the call, I went through every room of Hillside Cottage. Not in a dramatic or ceremonial way. Simply walked through each room, as I do sometimes when I need to remember where I am and what I have and what it amounts to. The kitchen. The sitting room with Gerald's books still on their shelves. The bedroom. The garden view from the landing window. Thomas's room. I stood in Thomas's room for a while. It smelled of old house and evening, as it always does. The desk chair that had been his was at an angle I had left it the last time I sat there. The view from the back window was the garden, still well tended, Tom's work visible in the neat beds and the maintained borders. I said, to the room and to whoever might be in it in whatever sense the people we have loved and lost might be in the rooms they occupied, "It's ours again. Just so you know." Then I called Martin. He answered on the second ring. I said, "The house is back in my name as of this morning." He said, "Good. That's right." I said, "Clara came to see me in September. She told me about your father's letter." A very long silence. He said, "I should have told you that myself. I was going to. I kept not doing it." I said, "Yes. You have a pattern of not doing the things you intend to do about this house. He said, I know. I said, Martin, I want to say something about your father's letter, because I have been thinking about it since September and I have arrived somewhere with it that I want you to know. He said, of course. I said, your father knew you. He knew the kind of trouble you might find yourself in and the kind of thinking you might do in that trouble. He left you a permission because he loved you and because he thought, with his characteristic long-term thinking, that you might need it. I do not know if he fully considered the specific way you would use it. I suspect he imagined something more transparent, that you would come to me with the letter, show it to me, and we would make a decision together. But I was not there, and he was not there, and you were desperate, and you made the choice you made. I said, what your father's letter tells me is that he trusted you. He trusted you with the thing that mattered most to him, which was me and this house. He believed you would handle that trust responsibly. You did not handle it responsibly. That is a grief I will carry, not for the house, which is back where it belongs, but for the fact that my husband trusted you and that trust was, in the end, not quite fully deserved. Martin said, I know. He said, is there a way forward? For us? I said, yes. I believe there is. It will take time and it will require honesty from you of a kind that has not always come easily. But yes. You are my son. You are all I have of the family I built in this house. And your father trusted you. I am going to try to understand why he did, and to find the version of you that justified that trust. He was quiet for a moment. He said, thank you, Mum. I said, come for Christmas. Bring the children. He said, yes. We'll be there. It has been 8 months since Hillside Cottage was restored to my name. I want to tell you honestly where things stand, because honest accounting is what this story has always required, and I am not going to prettify the ending now that I have arrived at it. Martin came for Christmas. He brought Clara and Oliver. We were 4 people around a table that has had many configurations over 50 years and that accommodated this particular configuration with the specific ease of a table that has known much harder occasions. Martin and I are not back to where we were before the discovery. I do not think we will be, and I have made my peace with that. What we have is something more careful and, perhaps, more honest than what we had before, a relationship built on a clearer understanding of who we each are, without the comfortable approximation that family relationships sometimes allow to persist for decades. He calls every Sunday. The calls are not always easy. Sometimes they are very easy, because underneath everything he is my son and I have loved him since before he could speak, and that love does not stop simply because it has had to accommodate a great deal of complicated information about the person it is directed toward. Clara comes to Hillside Cottage independently, occasionally, on her own initiative. She is 17 and she is applying to universities, and she has asked me to read her personal statement, which I have done, twice, with detailed notes, because I am 78 and I taught English for 15 years before I retrained as a bookkeeper, and personal statements are something I know something about. Her personal statement is very good. She writes about the relationship between honesty and difficulty, about how the hardest true thing is usually more valuable than the easiest comfortable one. She does not mention Hillside Cottage. She does not need to. The thinking is there. Oliver, who is 15, came with Martin at Christmas and spent most of it outdoors in the garden with Tom, who happened to be working that day and who taught him how to prune the rose bushes in the specific way Gerald had always pruned them. Oliver has Gerald's hands. I noticed this watching him work, the particular shape of the fingers, the way he held the secateurs. It was unexpected and it was one of the better moments of the year. Rose came from New Zealand in February, for 3 weeks. She had planned the trip before the discovery but had arranged to stay longer once it happened, and the 3 weeks were more honest and more necessary than any 3 weeks Rose and I had spent together in the preceding 20 years of distance. We talked about everything. About the house. About Martin. About Gerald's letter and what it meant that Gerald had known his son well enough to prepare for this and had not thought to warn me. About whether Gerald was wise or simply, in one specific respect, a man who had kept a thing to himself that he should have shared. Rose said, "You and Dad had 40 years of sharing things. One thing he kept is not a pattern." I said, "No. One thing kept is an anomaly. I hold it as an anomaly." She said, "Are you angry at him? For the letter?" I thought about this carefully. I said, "I am not angry. I miss him. I miss being able to ask him why. I miss the conversation we would have had about this, which would have been long and careful and would have ended with my understanding something I didn't understand before. That is what I miss most. Not that he kept it. That I cannot talk to him about why." Rose said, "That is very much what grief is, I think. Wanting the specific conversation you can no longer have." I said, "Yes. That is exactly what it is. Helen has updated all my legal documentation. My will is current and specific and clear. A new power of attorney is in place, jointly held by Rose and by Helen herself, with proper safeguards and dual authorization requirements. My affairs are in order in a way they have never been quite as specifically in order before, which is perhaps the practical legacy of a year that required me to attend to all of these things that I had always meant to attend to properly. The house is mine. I want to say that simply, because simplicity is what this most fundamental fact deserves after the complexity of everything surrounding it. Hillside Cottage is registered in my sole name. The Virginia creeper climbs the left side of the facade as it has since 1987. The garden gate sags slightly to the left, as it has since Gerald installed it, and I have decided I will never have it adjusted because it is one of the things about this house that is most specifically Gerald and I do not want it to be otherwise. Thomas's room is mine. The desk chair is at the angle I left it. The room smells of old house and evening and, sometimes, I still imagine, very faintly, of the particular soap he used as a child. I have stopped telling myself this is my imagination. I have decided it is simply true. I want to say several things to end this story, because I think several different things are true about it simultaneously and I have never been comfortable with only saying the part that is easiest. The first thing, know the legal status of your own home. I am 78 years old and I had lived in my house for 50 years and I did not know the specific legal particulars of my own property title. I had never had reason to check. I had trusted that the situation was as I understood it to be. This trust was, in my specific case, misplaced. It is not necessarily misplaced in yours. But the knowing is easy and costs nothing and the not knowing can cost, as I discovered, a great deal more than it should. Check your title. Know who owns what. Have a solicitor you trust who keeps these things current. The second thing, the people who betray us while loving us are the most morally complex situations our lives produce. Martin forged my signature. He deprived me of ownership of my home for 10 years. He also, in his distorted and cowardly way, believed he was acting in my eventual interest. He also acted under the shadow of a letter from a dead man he had loved and lost and who had trusted him with something he had not fully deserved. These things are all simultaneously true. None of them cancels the others. The full truth is all of them at once. The third thing, the children of our children show us who we are in ways we do not always expect. Clara came to Hillside Cottage alone, at 17, because she had decided that I deserved the whole truth. She made that decision herself, without prompting, without anyone telling her it was the right thing to do, against what she knew might be her father's preference. She did it because she is, underneath everything, a person who believes that honesty is worth the discomfort it costs. I do not know where she learned that. Perhaps she simply arrived with it. Perhaps it was transmitted by Gerald through Martin in some way that neither of them fully understood. Perhaps it will be her version of Gerald's letter, the specific gift she passes on without entirely knowing she is passing it. The fourth thing, what we build in the places where we live does not belong only to the walls and the garden and the legal title. It belongs to the people who lived there and the things that happened there and a particular quality of light on an ordinary Tuesday morning. My house was mine throughout the 10 years it was legally in Martin's name, in the way that matters most. It was mine in the daily, lived, accumulated sense that a home becomes yours when you have spent 50 years of ordinary life inside it. No document changes that. No forgery and no 10 years of legal misfiling and no complicated inheritance of a dead man's permission changes what Hillside Cottage is and has been and will continue to be for as long as I am in it. It is mine. It is where Thomas's room is. It is where Gerald's gate sags slightly to the left. It is where the view from the landing window extends, on clear days, further than seems quite plausible. I am 78 years old and it is mine and I intend to remain in it for as long as I possibly can. If Vera's story moved you, please give this video a like and subscribe. We share powerful complete stories every single week. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And tell me in the comments, what was the moment that changed your understanding of this story? Was it the forgery? Gerald's letter? Clara's visit? Or something else entirely? I read every single comment and I want to know what stayed with you most.